starting on time, which is great. Can't always promise that will happen throughout the process, but there's a lot that goes into all of this. But tonight we're ready for you. So, my name is Brian Wright. I'm the principal of Town Planning and Urban Design Collaborative, and I'm leading the consulting team that's helping to work on the new zoning ordinance update. How many of you have participated in something thus far related to the new zoning ordinance? Planapalooza, any think tank meetings or anything? Okay, great. So some of you. So what we're going to do in this portion of the evening is I'm going to give a brief and high-level overview of kind of what the point of all of this is, what it's all about. And then when I'm done, you all are going to go out in the hallway and walk and look on the walls. There's different posters and different pieces of information that will be interesting or relevant to you. And there are people from the city staff that are out there to answer very specific and technical questions. Like if you're, wondering about your property in particular, you can say, hey, here's where I live. What's going on with my property? And they can help you find it on the map, and they'll explain it all to you. So we're not going to get into that level of detail in this room, but that is available in the hall. When I'm done with this presentation, we're going to have a short Q&A if you have any high-level questions about what any of the things we talked about in this presentation. If you're confused about anything, because what we want to make sure is that going through this process that everybody really understands what this is about. Because it's not every day that you're asked to contemplate zoning changes and what does it mean. This is great. People are still coming in the room. So let's get going here. All right, so I mentioned that we're a consulting firm and we work all over the country. So don't worry, we've done this before. We also happen to be just 2 blocks away. This is 5th and Church. So our office is there right next to 906 Studio Architects. So for me, I love this. I'm really excited. I would say this during the Planapalooza a lot. I got to walk over here to this meeting instead of getting on an airplane. So that's great. But we write these zoning ordinances. We do, comprehensive plans, high-level documents. We work on specific plans even for developers. And so we really, from the largest scale to the smallest scale, focus on the planning and zoning and design of things. So that's kind of my background. What you guys have here, what came before us was Envision Franklin. And Envision Franklin really established the vision for the future, that this, the direction that the city was gonna head in moving forward. So that document has been out for a little while and has been well received, but the zoning ordinance was lagging behind. It wasn't up to date with the Envision Franklin document. So this process has been about fixing some of the stuff that people didn't love about the old zoning ordinance, and there was a long list people would come and talk about. But then two, most importantly, making sure that the rules and regulations about what you can and can't do with the property matched up with what the vision was for the future. So to avoid those conflicts, as you could imagine, if the zoning doesn't say what the vision says, it becomes a problem. So Envision Franklin is set up to move forward a set of specific design concepts for character. If you think about different areas of the city as different characters, rather than focusing just on the zoning uses, separating one use from the next. So this is a map that's available online, and I think there's probably one out there as well. It has all the different design concepts shown on there in different colors, but big picture, here's what they're looking at. So regional commerce, which would be things like that people would be coming from a distance to go and patronize. So this is obviously pretty intense. This wouldn't be, like downtown Franklin. This might be what you would see maybe Cool Springs as redevelopment occurs there. Some of that might happen. There's neighborhood commercial, which is more small scale, and there are certain areas around the city where there's already some commercial that's adjacent to residential neighborhoods, but it's more like sort of strip malls and things that don't necessarily fit in with the character of that neighborhood. But having that commercial is a nice convenience where somebody can just walk down to the restaurant or to a corner store or whatever. So that's what the neighborhood commercial would kind of represent. There's different residential design concepts, everything from large lot residential, historic residential, compact, single family, mixed residential, which would have multitude of different types of residential in it, and then multifamily will be part of that as well, and those are all in different districts around There's a conservation subdivision concept, which is for areas that are more rural. And so in the conservation subdivision areas, you'd actually preserve 50% of the land in open space, and then you would develop there in a way that's a bit more rural in feeling and more sensitive to the character of the landscape. Then there's obviously the development reserve, which is land where you sort of keep it agricultural, or you're not trying to do some intense development there. So that was sort of in a nutshell, and that's a very small nutshell of Envision Franklin, but it's these big ideas, a vision forward. And in each of those design concepts in the document, the Envision Franklin document, it talks about what the specific intended, so even things like some lot sizes that might be in these different districts, or building heights. There's some specifics in there, even though it's a visionary document. Now, as I said, the zoning ordinance is what allows that vision to be implemented, and so this becomes the key element of that implementation process. So, with zoning ordinance, really just allows that vision to become a reality. It divides the city into zones, or if you're thinking about it in a different way, it actually starts to connect them, because we think about how one zone transitions into another, so that there's not sort of a stark contrast between the different zones. And then it also sets a standard for how the land can be used and what can be developed there, what that development looks like to a certain extent. And it really is, all the rules and regulations. So if this is your first time to think about or hear about zoning, that's what that is. I don't want to take that for granted. So the thing about zoning is interesting. So you can write the zoning ordinance to give you a number of different outcomes. You can write a zoning ordinance that results in a place like this, or you can write a zoning ordinance that results in a place like this. Like this place actually had zoning, right? And so what goes into that document becomes really important. And by the looks on all of your, not all, but most people's faces, I'm imagining that you're hoping the zoning ordinance doesn't give us this, even though you might like the Sports Authority or Best Buy. But this, probably isn't, and what we've heard through the community input process isn't what people are looking for. So it's important how we write that zoning ordinance, and that vision has to be part of it. So one of the things that people always come out and talk about when you start talking about zoning, or changes to things, or a development project comes out, people always start talking about, if there's nothing else that they know about, they say, we want more open space, green space, and that's sort of the extent of the discussion. And so we work in communities where they've worked for years, and they require developers to put these massive percentages of open space in a new development, and they think that they've really accomplished something because that percentage number is high, in their mind. But what happens is, unlike in the old days when open space in a city or town would be sort of the central square, the main park, the gathering place where the whole community would come for parades and whatever, it ends up open space often is just sort of whatever's left over when you start moving outside the property lines and see how much you can fit on the land. And so that open space, while it's green, is not usable, it's not useful. And in fact, if you go back here, you're not quite sure if people are going to call the police on you because you're peeping in their back window. Am I allowed to throw a Frisbee back there or not? So anyway, and again, this is high level. There are many, many, many sort of examples that we can walk through in the zoning ordinance where we start to try to solve some of these types of issues. So we become more specific about what does open space mean? Parks and plazas and squares and green spaces and pocket parks and all of that, rather than just open space for open space sake. So we want it to be usable. This is an interesting example. I wish you could all see each of your faces here. So these are row houses or townhouses, as are these. And so even the same building type, the same use on that property, this is a residential use, so attached residential, you can have very, very different results based on how that zoning is written. And so what we find is that cities that are most successful around the country, that have the highest values, that maintain their value over time, are those that are very, very particular about what happens at the end of the day when something is built. And you say, well, who knows, everybody's taste is different, architecturally, and you might like something I might not. And the zoning ordinance only gets into a certain level of detail architecturally. But there are certain things that it can cover that keep the things that tend to be sort of universally not voted for as often. If you took what we call a visual preference survey, you say, do you like the ones on the left or the ones on the right? Typically, the ones on the left get all the green dots, and these on the right get the red dots. So we know that all over the country. So we need to make sure that we cover that. So I mentioned a couple of times the Planapalooza process. And so what we wanted to do in this zoning ordinance update is make sure that it was a very open and public process, so that people at the end of the day felt like they were able to have an impact on what went into the zoning ordinance, that they understood it, that they could give input. And so we held this Planapalooza. It was a multi-day event, and we basically live in our office only 2 blocks away. We set up our office here in City Hall in the training room down there at the end of the hall, and we were here, morning into the night. We had presentations. We had hands-on workshops where people gathered around the table and did exercises. We had the voting, the dots that I was just talking about with the, do you like this or that, all up and down the halls here. It went on for several days because we know that people can't always make it to a presentation at a certain time. So we're available whenever people wanted to drop in. And so that was kind of different than the way it's normally done and has been done in the past. We had a series of presentations. We had technical meetings where there's a topic where we talk about design and architecture, or we talk about parks and open space, or whatever the case may be, and people gather around. So it's a little bit more of an intimate group setting, so people could talk about those specific topics. Here's all the people up and down the halls here putting dots and making votes. And here's some of the results of the things that we heard. And that's what's important in this process, is that we're not just going and saying, well, we as planners think that the zoning should say this. We say, here's what we've heard from the community. And then we sort of, underneath all of that, bring in some of the things that we see that work best around the country and also would be relevant to Franklin. But some of the things we saw that people liked were activated pedestrian environments with outdoor dining and outdoor seating and stuff. And again, obviously not everywhere. These aren't one-size-fits-all solutions. This might not be appropriate in your neighborhood. Your next-door neighbor might not want to be having an outdoor cafe, right? People like masonry, so bricks and stone. They also like more natural materials, or windows that look like windows, not just sort of glass walls that are reflective. Here's the things they didn't like. They didn't like the things that were really focused on that you had to drive to it. There were big parking lots all around these buildings that didn't really relate to the street. You see there's sort of not much of a sidewalk here, if any, and there's no storefronts, any of that. They really liked the activated storefronts and the vibrant streetscapes that you see in the sort of neighborhood scale commercial pictures here. They didn't like conventional suburban apartment complexes. And it wasn't that, and as we got down to it, we were finding more and more, it's not just that they didn't like apartments. They didn't like the way that we get apartments, not just in Franklin, but really pretty much in most places around the country. Because when you look at old historic neighborhoods, there are beautiful apartment buildings scattered next to $1 million mansions, and no one thinks twice about it, right? But when you get these massive suburban style apartment complexes, it has a different feel that people were responding negatively to. When we were talking about bigger buildings, they were saying that they liked the facades to be broken up so that it was more vertical, so it felt taller than wide. And that they like sort of if you're going to do a big building, sort of to mix an industrial kind of architectural feel with some modern stuff. So there's a hint of traditional going back to what people love about the city. They liked in single family. They really liked more traditional forms and not as much modern architecture when it comes to residential units. So in the ordinance, several of the top changes, one of the things it did was start to align the zoning districts with Envision Franklin, as I said, and that was just, we keep coming back to that over and over because it's so important. So when you leave here, one of the things you want to do if you haven't is take a look at Envision Franklin. Go online and study it a little bit. It's not too long, and it's lots of pictures, so I like to look at it. We also reduced the number of overlay districts. There was the zoning districts, but then there's all these overlays on top of overlays. It was very, very confusing. So even if you're a design professional, a planner, an engineer, you go to open up the old zoning ordinance and you're like, you need a spreadsheet and a map and how to figure out even what you can do with the property, much less if you're just a average citizen who had a piece of property you want to know what to do with. So we got rid of some of those and we added a couple of other overlays that were really relevant and helped to accomplish some things like the scenic corridor overlay district. Also, refined the building and site design standards to make them simpler to use, so that people really knew what the standards were, because the process right now is, a developer brings in a piece of property and they kind of go through a process, and there are rules and standards in the zoning, but the way that it's set up is, you go through and they, it's reviewed, and the standards are there, but they're never quite sure exactly, what is the expectation. So we try to shore that up so it's easier for the community to know what to expect on the other end, as well as the developers. So the setting those expectations was really important, so that people weren't afraid each time development came through the process, or what are we going to get when somebody develops something. And then we're also working to make improvements to the usability of it. And it's, when you look at the old ordinance and compare it to the new one, and I'll show you an example here. So, so here's the old zoning districts. There's all these pages, and these are stacked on top of each other, so it's not as confusing as it looks. But it was pretty difficult to dig into it. And all of that is now started to be simplified into pages like this. So you can easily figure out what's what. And it's really, that's the thing we keep hearing from everybody. It's so much easier to use when they look at it, which is great. That's step one. And then we hope also that, all the good stuff, important stuff is in there that people want to see. But you can go online at zonefranklin.com, and that's the other thing. So for people who haven't been able to come and participate in person, there's been the web page that's been set up so that people could follow along and actually participate in exercises online if they couldn't be here. So that's really great. So we've been able to reach a lot more people. But the other thing that's there is the zoning ordinance draft. If you haven't looked at it yet, you can go there. And it's really cool because when you open that document, each of the like topics and the chapters and the table of contents and the main points and things that are defined, you can click on them and it takes you to where you're supposed to be, instead of saying, see reference 7.3.6.2, and then you have to where is that, and flip through. You click on it and it takes you right there. It's really, really nice to go through. It's very simple. So zonefranklin.com. So upcoming opportunities for input. We are here right now, tonight. Then there is tomorrow also drop-in office hours at the planning department. So if you have some specific questions that you don't get answered in the hallway, you can go and sit down and they'll talk to you. Then there are another set of office hours drop-in on the 20th of September. There'll be additional public meetings in the fall, and the adoption is slated for spring 2020. So it should be, because we've gone through all this process thus far and making it where everybody's had access to it and been able to be involved, it shouldn't be one of those things where you come in and it's like, there's a bunch of people who are in opposition to it, because there's been so many opportunities to weigh in, to give input. And I tell people, if there's something you don't like, that's a deal breaker for you, just tell us right away. So we can know what it is, so we can start to think like, oh, what's the issue with that? Did we goof up here? Or is a lot of times, again, I don't know all of your backgrounds here, but people, it's a lot of times it's the first time they've looked at a zoning ordinance. When you see these signs pop up that says rezoning and whatever, you're like, what is going on? And you show up at an event like this, and then you look at something for a second, and then you're like, oh, I think this is what it means, but you're not sure. A lot of times people just have a misunderstanding of what even it says. And so we can understand what it is that the concern is. We can be like, oh, yeah, I see why you're concerned. There's something that needs to be tweaked. Or, oh, that's not what it means, actually, if you look at this, and we get a lot of that. So, and that's okay. You're not expected to be zoning experts. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure that the zoning ordinance works for businesses. It needs to work for the community. It needs to work for people at all stages of life. Because what we find is that, as the country, we're aging, but we're also getting younger people coming in, and we're having, different demographics that live here. We have people who are sort of, young and creative and vital, and there's people who've been out and been working a long time, and they're ready to settle down and do something that's a little bit slower pace. A place like Franklin is a place where you have all those people, and you have people who've been here forever, multiple generations, right? Not just people who've been here 30 years. I'm talking about people who've been, here 100 years or more. And so we want to make sure that you have something for everybody in the zoning ordinance. One of the things that I find so often is people look at something and they see, maybe one of these pictures that popped up here tonight. You go, oh, who would want to live like that? Who wants to be able to reach out and touch their, give their neighbor a high five out the window? That's not for me. I like some land. I've got dogs. I like the dogs to run, whatever. And it's like, good. You got that? And somebody who doesn't want all that to mow and doesn't have dogs and likes to high-five their neighbor has this other thing, you know. So we want to make sure that even if it's not our preference for something, that we haven't precluded everybody else from being able to do something else. The other thing that's amazing is when you start looking at the city of Franklin and what's left to develop, there's not much. There's not much left. And so the things that we're talking about that are changes, unless it's a redevelopment of something, it's really just a small percentage of the land mass of the city, and most of it is developed, except for the 16 blocks or however many we have in the historic core, is developed in conventional suburban development that was, you know, super popular from, you know, 1950 to, you know, 1998. And still is popular because people still move into those neighborhoods, right? And so some of the tweaks and the changes that we're talking about, some of these more, you know, walkability and bikeability and all this, you know, these buzzwords you hear these days, it's sort of like the last bits that we have to allow us to continue to be competitive in the future for what these changing preferences are in the country. So it works for all stages of life. It works economically, so it's an economic driver. So development is, you know, a lot of people don't like development, but development is one of the things that allows us to, you know, have all this great quality of life going on here, all the services we like. So we have to make sure that we, you know, for instance, don't put Cool Springs out of business, right? It's our economic engine, you know. But then also, probably the most important thing, the thing that we've heard the most, and we hear this the most in nearly every city we work in that has any kind of character, you have to make sure that the zoning ordinance doesn't ruin the character that we love, and that all new development adds to that, right? It's not completely alien. It hasn't been, you know, imported, and, you know, it's like, oh, well, that's just like every other city around the country. What is Franklin? What is so important about this place? What do people love? So the new zoning ordinance has to take that into consideration and make sure that that's one of the fundamental principles that we're moving forward with. So that's the high level, the fast. Sorry if I was talking fast, but all the good stuff's out in the hallway. But a couple minutes here, a few questions. Anybody have any high-level questions we want to talk about? And if it's too detailed, I'll send you in the hallway. But yes. Yes. Okay. So.
Are you talking about the core of the city, or are you talking about everything within our urban growth boundary?
Yeah, that's a good point. So just in general, what you see is if you look at the urban growth boundary, and this is all cities, you know, unless they're a brand new city, but most cities we find this to be the case. Like, I'll give you an example. We're working up in New Hampshire right now, in Bedford, New Hampshire, and they were freaking out. We were writing a new comprehensive plan, and they were like, we don't want any more growth. This is going to ruin everything. And we started looking at it, and we realized they had like a few hundred acres left out of their entire city that was even available for any new development. And so I guess my point is, you know, I don't know how many acres exactly we have, but the what? Oh, how much we have? Yes, so thank you. This one here. Right. So we've got these areas here, but a lot of these areas, you know, they are zoned and are intended to be particular rural character and all of that stuff, right? And so what I'm talking about is the not necessarily all outside the growth boundary, but the other areas that are around that are immediately adjacent to people's neighborhoods and those kind of things. But the urban growth boundary is a whole separate consideration of all that. So that's a very good clarification. But at the end of the day, what we've got to do is figure out, how do we address the concerns about character? How do we address the concerns about growth? And then also we hear about traffic. We hear about those sorts of things. And I hear somebody say, we got these terrible traffic problems. And then the very next thing they say is, and all this talk about connecting streets, I don't want somebody to connect to my street. They're going to have, you know, drive-through traffic and all this stuff. There's a link, a direct link between how land is developed and those sorts of issues, traffic issues, et cetera. You think, well, if it's more dense, it's going to be worse and more traffic. In fact, that's not necessarily the case. What happens is if you have disconnected network of streets and things, so that every street has to connect into these arterials, so that any person who wants to go anywhere has to get on a few of these roads will clog up. No matter how many lanes we add, no matter what you do, it is a traffic problem that's caused by this development pattern that we've had over the past, you know, several decades. And so when we start to look at how we make some tweaks and some changes, some of these things we need to think through, how can it actually help us solve some of the problems that we have as we're trying to mitigate causing any new problem. So, any other? Yes?
In all this planning you're doing with all this density, where are you gonna put schools?
Schools.
Yeah, I don't see any land plan for schools with all this influx you're gonna have of students.
Yeah, so that is a much higher level question than the zoning.
We're responsible, Franklin's responsible for making the county have to build so many new schools, and the land costs are just exorbitant.
Yes. No, I'm not saying that it's not related. I'm just saying that the zoning ordinance doesn't specify where that happens. And so it has to be thought through as you're making decisions and going into in the future, for sure.
And
Yep.
also, if people have a choice of where to live, if we all know all this stacked up.
Yep.
Show me where you have in these plans for larger lots. Like acre,
Oh, yeah, so that's all in the hallway. So they've got all that, all those.
are there any in this plan, zoning plan?
So the zoning isn't a plan, right? So the zoning is just the rules and regulations that apply to each piece of property. Now, what you find is, for the most part, the property that is already a certain way is intended to continue on being that way, right? It's not intended to change. So, yes, so what you'll find is when you go out there, ask them about where are the larger lots, and they'll point you to the map. Yep, yes, sir.
You've noted that the plan needs to address all life stages.
Yep.
And several studies that have been engaged by the city in the past have said, recognize our senior housing opportunities as one of the top priorities in terms of integrating and allowing engaging senior housing.
Right.
In the current zoning ordinance, senior housing, if it's attached, such as independent living, things of that nature, falls under the apartment classification. Yet, analysis shows that most people that want to sell their home or need to sell their home and move into a smaller footprint, if you will, prefer to stay within 5 to 7 miles of where they have lived the majority of their life or where they sold their single-family home.
Yep.
And the current zoning ordinance is absolutely at odds with that because it says all apartments need to be on the interstate. So the older we get, we're being relegated to live at the interstate.
Yeah.
How does this ordinance address some of those issues for senior housing?
Yeah, well, and I'll say, you guys are gonna get tired of hearing me say this, the details of that are a hallway question, but I'll give you a big picture answer to that. Because there has, over the years, been an opposition to multifamily and apartments, it's when you classify things in that light, even if it is something that's, senior housing or assisted, it now starts to be in those areas, as you pointed out, where people are okay with it being multifamily. And so that's a high level sort of philosophical thing to even sort through as a community. But it is addressed in the zoning ordinance. So when you get out there, that's a question for the crew in the hallway. Yes.
As you guys were working through this new ordinance, I'm assuming took like demographics and benchmarked against other communities around the country. Any communities that you could mention that maybe we could go on their websites and look at what their ordinances look like?
Well, so here's what I would say. Yes, we do look at that, and because we work all over the country, it's good, and we can see, oh yeah, that's like same issues we have over in this city or that city or whatever. At the end of the day, when you write the zoning ordinance and you have character as sort of one of your primary considerations, how you get to that character is a combination of multiple things. It's a combination of how you're used to doing things here. It's a combination of what the process is like here that you're used to living with. It's a combination of community input and how the preferences have changed since the last time. All that we do is really, really localized and focused on Franklin-centric. And so even though we don't even have to do research to benchmark it. We could simply just, look on our server. We really do try to just focus here. So I can't say, oh, yeah, go look at this or that. I mean, Carmel, Indiana is a similar sort of demographic and similar thoughts and ideas. That's a place we've worked as well. But, I would say My best recommendation is to focus on here and the ordinance as it is. And then if you have other places in mind that you might like, I always say, well, what places, if you could be anywhere besides Franklin, because Franklin's great, where would you be? You know, most places will say, oh, I'd like, have you heard of Franklin, Tennessee? Is what they say to me when I'm in other parts of the country, which is great. But pick that place and go look at their ordinance and see, you know, the results, I think is the way to see it. So I hand, yeah.
Thank you, Brian. Hope this is high level for you. Regarding Airbnbs,
Uh.
specifically non-owner occupied Airbnbs,
Yeah.
what direction do you think we're going in and when might that be effective, perhaps spring of 2020?
So that's a hallway question. That's not high level enough for me. So it's above my pay grade, below my pay.
We have to leave?
No, it's addressed. It's addressed. I just don't know. And again, too, the other bad thing about working in a lot of other places is it gets jumbled up in my head. And so something like that, I don't want to say, oh, here's how it's addressed, because I may say what they did in Carmel or somewhere, and y'all would freak out. So one more here.
So you said you've worked in other areas. In general, when you're working on zoning ordinances like this, I noticed right now we have a separate traffic study going on.
Yeah.
Do they ever combine them and say, well, look at your map and what you're projecting and what the traffic will look like specifically for those new things, and then make adjustments accordingly?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. Like a lot of times in the comprehensive plan, it's like a more so like Envision Franklin is a comprehensive vision, but it isn't full, you know, economic analysis and transportation analysis and all that that we might normally have in a full comprehensive plan. And so those transportation related issues would be addressed, but the type of specific considerations you're talking about related to traffic, to sync them up with zoning, you know, each development starts to have its own impacts and has its own sort of, you know, issues. So when you look at a traffic study, you start seeing, well, where are the problems now? What are the issues? And then what are some proposed solutions? Well, one of the things that you would do is you would say, actually, that the traffic impact study would be impacted by the zoning ordinance, because when you do it right, what you normally do is land use first, transportation second. People are like, wait, how does that work? I don't understand. We need to, you know, that's going to yield traffic problems. Well, when you start, that's back to that comment I made about how you develop land, that pattern of development has an impact on the traffic. And so if the traffic study is done before the zoning ordinance and it says, oh, well, here are the problems you're going to have, and it's assuming that you're going to continue on with the development pattern that you've been doing, that is disconnected and sort of, you know, everything's being put onto these certain roads or these certain intersections, it doesn't take that into consideration. And so they have to sort of work hand in hand, but typically in an ideal scenario you would want the zoning ordinance to be sorted out first, because at the end of the day the capacity of a community is limited, you know, in a few different ways. One is what the market will bear, what people will buy, you know, how much can be developed and occupied. But because we focus so much on character, we actually let character be the first consideration, right? And so even if, let's say there was a market to develop, you know, 20 stories on Main Street, wouldn't do that, right? That wouldn't be the thing to do, right? So you have to focus on that character. So at the end of the day, the traffic study does relate to the zoning ordinance, but it's a very sort of complicated dynamic. And so here's the other thing. Because this has been a suburban community for so long and sort of developed in that mindset, and the bulk of the land mass has developed in the conventional sort of the time when everybody's focused on driving everywhere, a lot of the issues that we're facing today are as a result of that. But when we start to think about how we solve that, it's not just a traffic study, it's really what you want to be looking at as a transportation analysis, a transportation which includes transit and cars and all of these things. Because a lot of times what we're doing is we're solving problems like Cool Springs at lunch hour or Cool Springs in the morning or in the afternoon. And so we're designing the entirety of the city to solve those problematic 3 times a day, right? The whole rest of the time now, the place is designed and it looks like it's ready to be a freeway. because we've solved those problems. So I see them looking at telling me to hurry up out here. So I could do this all night. So all the details are in the hallway, but you can come back in for the next presentation and I'll say the same stuff and we can ask new questions.